In this lecture, we're going to be covering the basics of public finance. I'm going to cover 4 topics. The first is the 4 questions of public finance, which we mentioned in the introduction video. Second, we're going to introduce constrained choice, which will lead us to income and substitution effects. This is the basic way that economists think about choice. We'll have a bunch of this strewn throughout the class, and I'll introduce some of the more in-depth insights that economists have had over time as they come up throughout the class. Then I'm going to talk about public goods, sort of the quintessential public finance topic, and then cost-benefit analysis, will sort of kick off the major topics throughout this class. So first, the first 4 questions, or the 4 questions of public finance. First, when should the government intervene? The first and sort of stereotypical answer here is when there's an episode of market failure. Now, most economists, and definitely individuals who don't study economics, carefully will just leap at any example of market failure. But we want to be very careful, because a market failure is a situation when we see a market not achieve its efficient outcome. We'll have a bunch more on this when I get to public finance. When I get to public goods later in this lecture. But this lesson has to be carefully applied because it needs to be subject to the lessons of the calculation debate. So the calculation debate is mid-1900s, right? So 1950, 1940, in this era when Marxism and communism in general is beginning to take hold and sort of press into academic spheres. And some very important economists, Nobel laureates like Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, etc., really take on this question, and it comes to be called the calculation debate. Central to the calculation debate is the knowledge problem. So the knowledge problem is that in order to organize a market, it requires knowledge, and really not just knowledge, technical knowledge, but preferences, the way that people value things that isn't available to individuals. So when we have a market failure, that doesn't automatically mean that a government should intervene. One of my favorite examples of this is an excerpt, which I'll post in WT class, from Stephen Landsberg's book called Can You Outsmart an Economist? There's just 5 pages of it here, so I'll go over it briefly, and the story of the agriculture czar. But he starts off with a question. So basically the format of this book is he poses a puzzle and then see if you can come up with the solution. So I encourage you to read this, but I'll kind of walk you through it now. So he starts off by asking a question, proposing a puzzle really, called card golf. Okay, so each of 10 people hold a stack of cards. On each card is a number which the holder can see, but you cannot see. Everyone's stack is different, so stacks have several different cards with the same number. In other stacks, all the numbers might be different, so on. Now, your task is to collect 50 cards. Your score is the total of all the numbers on those cards. How do you minimize your score? What's your strategy? Okay, well, the first thing you could do is simply ask 10 people to hand over their lowest 5 cards, 5 from each, right? One person's lowest card might be 100, right? Some people's 5 lowest cards might be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or even 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, right? So this isn't going to work very well, right? Instead, a much better attempt at this is to ask everyone to hand over their 1 cards. Then say, everyone hand over your 2 cards, continue, so on. Your cards with the number 3 on them until you've got 50 cards. You've automatically minimized your score. How do we know that? Well, we can be quite sure you've got the lowest possible score. After all, the only way to change your score would be to swap one of the cards in your hand with a card that's not in your hand. That can't possibly drive down the score, because every single card outside your hand is got to be worse, or at least not any better, than any card that you're currently holding. Okay, how does this relate to economics? How does this relate to market failure? How does this relate to the calculation debate? Well, let's take that same idea, hold that idea in your head, and let's look at another puzzle. Okay, this is called the czar's dilemma. Okay, so the president appoints you as a czar of agriculture. Okay, there are 10 wheat farmers, each who can produce various quantities of wheat at various costs. Notice that would be extremely realistic, right? So farmer 1 can produce a bushel for $3, but their second bushel for $5, their third for $7, fourth for $9, and so on, right? These are numbers straight out of the example. Farmer 2 can produce a bushel for $1, a second for $4, a third for $8, and a fourth for $12, right? So notice they have different marginal cost curves. Hopefully you remember your micro principles micro, or maybe some of you have even had intermediate micro. So you should be visualizing marginal cost curve here. Okay, so all the farmers know their costs, but say you don't know any of them, as you obviously wouldn't, since if you're the czar of agriculture, you can't possibly know the cost structure of each and every farm inside your area of authority. Now your job is to arrange for a production of 50 bushels of wheat, and your goal is to conserve resources by minimizing production costs. This should sound familiar. This is straightforward communism. All right, now step 1, right, or solution here. You could ask each of the 10 farmers to produce 5 bushels of wheat as cheaply as possible, akin to asking all 10 players for their 5 lowest cards. Right? Some farmers are going to produce very cheaply, some are not going to produce very cheaply, right? So one farmer's lowest bushel might cost 100, while another farmer can produce 20 bushels all for $1, right? Of course, the answer here is to direct each farmer to produce as many bushels as possible at $1, and then $2, and then $3, and so on. Now you can be sure you've minimized the cost of bushels, cost of 50 bushels of wheat, right? After all, the only way to change production would be to swap a higher cost or equal cost production out for a unit that you've already produced, right? So how does this work? You go and you make an announcement, right? Everybody please produce as many bushels as you can at $1, right? Now, what happens here? Say farmer 1 produce 1 less bushel, and farmer 2 you're asked to produce 1 more. That can't drive down the cost because you've already collected all the units at the lower cost that you possibly can, right? Any bushel that's not produced must necessarily be more expensive. So the production cost must already be as low as possible. All right, hang in here with me. Now let's make the problem a little bit harder, or alternatively just more realistic. You're still serving as the czar. You're attempting to implement your solution to the preceding problem so you can get your 50 bushels of wheat. You start directing every farmer to produce as many bushels as possible at a cost of $1 per bushel. Of course, farmers wouldn't want to take these directions, and you have no way of punishing disobedience, right? This is where the authoritarian nature of autocratic governance comes in, right? But you can't effectively punish this, right? Because you don't know what their production costs are. This is fundamental reality, and it was a component of the previous puzzle, right? Okay, so how do we solve this? Well, here's the solution. First, announce you'll pay $1 for a bushel of wheat, right? Instead of directing them to do that, offer them a reward. You'll discover that every farmer who can produce a bushel for less than $1 will choose to do so. If that doesn't produce 50 bushels, announce you'll pay 2, and so on. Okay, now that works, right? It also, incidentally, renders you completely obsolete, because in the absence of a czar, the price system automatically implements the exact same solution. Demanders offer, say, $1 for a bushel of wheat. Suppliers who can produce that are happy to do it. Ones that can't, don't. If that doesn't meet the demand, price gets bid up, right? I mean, this is straightforward. How would things happen in any market where you're buying anything, right? This continues on until demand is met. And this brings me to the lesson that I really want to highlight for you here in this section. We want to be really careful. When should the government intervene? We can't accept the answer of just any old market failure, because we can't replicate this type of solution. So the moral of the story here is the price system does the best possible job of producing any given quantity of wheat, or really anything else, at the lowest possible cost, right? No czar, no government, no planning board, no government intervention, no mechanism can do better. Okay, this of course matters profoundly, right? Because costs are a measure of resource consumption. So if you've taken, hopefully you're coming to this class having taken principles of micro from me. If you haven't, hopefully you had a professor that highlighted this idea, right? Costs are measures of resource consumption. So to say that it costs $100 to produce something means it takes up $100 of resources that had other types of uses. This is the opportunity cost. We're going to see opportunity cost a bunch in this lecture. We're going to see opportunity cost a bunch in every lecture, probably going forward all throughout this class. It's one of those core economic ideas. Okay, so societies prosper by minimizing production, right? A system of prices and individual choices accomplishes exactly that. More on this when we get to public goods, right? So, therefore, a functioning price system must lie at the heart of any successful economy. Weirdly enough, we're having to circle back around to the calculation debate in many ways because this is a lesson that doesn't seem to take hold. The answer to that, of course, is in political economy, which will have its entire chapter later on in this class. So, there's two important differences between the puzzle that we gave and the world we actually live in. One of those is you actually know in advance you need 50 bushels of wheat. This is, of course, ridiculous. In reality, we don't know how many to produce of anything. That's another thing the market can do that government intervention cannot do. All right. Of course, in the puzzle, there are only 10 farms. In the U.S., there's 2 million farms. This applies to any and every market. We also don't know where the boundaries of the markets are. So here's a point that Landsberg doesn't even make, right? Which is farms aren't producing 2 million. There aren't 2 million farms producing for the U.S. for consumption all about the U.S., right? We're having different production in different places. We have to face transport costs. We'll have a lot of this when we get to transaction costs and the Coasian solution as well, right? So not only are there a bunch of farms, we don't know who they're serving, we don't know how much they want to make. The number of farms and consumers is constantly changing, on and on and on. The market can handle all of these things, right? One of the things that economist Russ Roberts points out, right, is nobody determines how much bread has to go to New York every day, yet there's plenty of bread in New York City pretty much every single day. Okay, there is another step in the czar's dilemma, and I think that is a massively important, but I've already gone on quite enough here, so I encourage you to read that. I'll take quiz questions out of this whole paper, so please be sure to read that after you get done with this video. The other time that economists recognize that the government often intervenes is in the case of redistribution. And this, of course, is a philosophical, moral, ethical question. I won't comment too much on it here, but we do want to recognize that redistribution is something that people in the public sphere often want. That can be good reasons, that can be bad reasons. It often comes at the cost of meritocracy. That's a little beyond the scope of this class, so we'll set that down and see if we can get back around to it later on. Second question, how might the government intervene? So what are ways that it would do it? Of course, the first examples that come to mind are taxes, subsidies, restrictions, and mandates. So basically, we look at private activity, we put a tax on it. We look at private activity, we give a subsidy to it. We look at private activity, we want to restrict it, or we want to mandate it. Of course, some examples of things that might be being discussed of mandating. So mandating means using government force to compel people to do a specific thing. Restrictions mean using government force to compel a people to not do a specific thing, right? Other cases of methods the government might use, public provision. The government just takes tax money, sets up the system to produce and distribute something, and publicly provides it. And then, of course, public financing of private provision. So take tax dollars and then purchase things that have been produced otherwise privately. We'll see examples of this strewn all throughout the class. Third, what is the effect of government intervention? There are two types of effects. The first is the direct effect, right? This is the effect that would be predicted if individuals did not change their behavior in response to the activity. I suppose this has its use, but really what we want to think about are indirect effects, right? These are effects that arise because individuals change their behavior. This is a lesson that is easy and obvious for economists and for some reason borders on impossible for prognosticators in the public sphere. So if you read articles, you hear politicians, right? They're always going to say, we're going to make a law, it's going to outlaw this, therefore that will stop happening. Of course, we can think of lots of examples. Maybe the quintessential example here is prohibition, right? We outlaw or place really high taxes on alcohol production, and alcohol production is going to stop, right? Well, of course not, right? Because there are many indirect effects effects that arise because individuals change their behavior, right? And so we want to think about those outcomes. There are lots of neat economic ideas such as bootleggers and Baptists that we'll get to later in the class. Fourth question, why do governments intervene in the ways that they do? The answer to this is political economy. Political economy is a theory of how the political process produces decisions that affect individuals and the economy. Long story short, with public choice political economy, politicians, bureaucrats, policymakers, anybody that's involved in this, they are people too. They have their own set of incentives, desires, motives, preferences, etc., and that forms the way that we get governance. So we're going to have entire lecture on that, so I'm going to leave that for now. Okay, next thing that I want to talk about is constrained choice. So constrained choice is really just marginal utility analysis. Marginal utility is the additional utility. Anytime I say utility, you can think of like benefit, right? So we can get benefit because it is helpful to us. We can get benefit because it is enjoyable to us. That's how we should think about utility. Marginal utility is any of this additional benefit that's gained by consuming an additional unit of good or service. Okay, so I eat another cheeseburger. I'm that much more satisfied. I enjoy the taste of the burger that much more. That's marginal utility. Okay, so our paired idea here is the marginal rate of substitution. All this should just be basic rehashing of principles and or intermediate. This is the rate at which the consumer is willing to trade one good for another. Okay, so here, let's take a look at this little graph that I've prepared. It's just good A and good B. An indifference curve is the combinations of good A and B that give us the same utility. Okay, so this curve right here, that's just saying if I'm any point A, point B, point C, if I'm any point along there, I'm just as happy as if I were any other point along the way, right? So why does it curve? It curves the way that it curves because we are able to reach the highest possible indifference curve, so utility increases as we move away from the origin. We are able to reach our highest possible utility with a combination of goods. So I'm just saying we typically, right, this is a traditional indifference curve. We can draw different shapes of indifferent curves for different things. But this is saying we can achieve our highest level of utility by enjoying a combination of things, right? So if I'm way up here, if I'm eating lots of A, let's say those are apples, and actually what's interesting, let's take a quick look just to highlight something else here. Let's say these are apples and bananas. I happen to be allergic to bananas. So my utility from bananas, my indifference curves would look like this. Why is that? Because it would go up by eating more apples, and it wouldn't change at all by eating more bananas. Okay, so in this scenario here, let's take a look at these curves over here now. We're saying somebody that enjoys apples and bananas. If I'm only eating apples, right, then I can trade off some apples for relatively few bananas, right? So big drop, small increase, and have the same amount of utility. On the other hand, if I'm eating lots and lots of bananas, right, then I can trade off a lot of bananas for a few apples, and I'll be happy, right? So this is diminishing marginal utility. The more I have of something, the less I enjoy of that thing. This is a near universal law. If you can think of a good exception to this, please email it to me because I'm going to include that in my future classes. So what is our marginal rate of substitution? That's the rate at which the consumer is willing to trade one good for another. That is this slope here. So these little white lines are the MRS, the marginal rate of substitution. Okay, so marginal rate of substitution changes, becomes more vertical as we move to the left, more horizontal as we move to the right, and that just recognizes that if I'm over here, the rate at which I will trade apples for bananas really flattens out, right? So I've traded down to where I'm way over here, and you say, here I want to trade for one of your apples. You're going to have to trade me 12 bananas, 20 bananas, 24 bananas, 2 bunches of bananas. That's what it'll take to get me to let go of this apple, right? If I'm over here, right? If I'm over here, I don't have many bananas, and I have many, many apples, right? Then the trade-off now goes the other way. Give me a dozen apples for 1 banana. So, okay, relatively straightforward. The other half of constrained choice is the budget constraint. So this is all the combinations of goods. Don't know why that says of. of goods and or services an individual can afford to buy based on their income and prices. Relatively straightforward. Don't let the math concern you here. I'm just saying your income is equal to the price of good A times the number of A that you buy plus the price of good B times the number of bananas that you buy, right? So, if this is $10 and these are $1 a piece, we're gonna actually have to write that out. Pardon me. If we have $10 in income and apples cost 1, bananas cost 2, right? And then I buy 3 of these, then I can buy 4 apples. That's all I'm saying here, relatively straightforward. That's going to give us this. So same thing, apples and bananas, just the quantity of those things on either axis. Our budget constraint is just that downward sloping line, right? Because if we're along this line, we have spent all of our money. Okay, so this brings us to the idea of opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the value of the next best foregone alternative, right? So let's break this down step by step. So what's value? Value is subjective and marginal, right? So if I say, you come to visit me in the office and I say, oh, I've got a gift for you, and I hand you a toaster. Is that valuable? Well, some of you don't have a toaster. That could be pretty valuable, right? Some of you might already, for whatever reason, maybe both your mom and your dad, when they dropped you off at the dormitory, they both gave you a toaster, and so now you already have 2 toasters. What's the value of the 3rd toaster? Very, very low, because 3 toasters not very useful. Now, alternatively, perhaps you don't have a toaster. I hand you a toaster, and you happen to love eating bagels for breakfast. This could be really, really value to you. That's subjective, right? Perhaps another of you doesn't eat breakfast at all, doesn't have any use for a toaster. That's why you didn't have one in the first place. That toaster is very limited in use. So value, subjective, and marginal. Okay. The next best, right? So when I do something, when I buy something, when I make any choice, I forego other things. Those things foregone, the cost of that is the next best alternative, right? So it's not all the other things, right? Because I can only do one thing. I can only make one choice in any one given context. So it's only the next best foregone alternative. Alternative in this case could be things that we do. It could be things that we buy, money that we spent. Any of those things are opportunity cost. Budget constraint is simply highlighting what is your opportunity cost, right? It's the price of the thing. So then that's how you measure foregone income. More on that in a moment. Okay, so combine these two things, what do we get? We get constrained choice. Constrained choice asks the basic question, what is the utility maximizing bundle that a consumer can afford? Okay, so I want to buy good A and good B. I want to consume those things to make me the happiest I can possibly be made. Utility increases as I go out. That is to say, the indifference curve 3 gives me more utility than indifference curve 2, gives me more utility than indifference curve 1, and so on. So I spend all my money. I've got a couple of options, right? Got a couple of options. I can be on point A, I can be on point B, I can be on point C, right? So in theory, right, there's an infinite number of indifference curves. They're actually a 3-dimensional plane, so I'm just highlighting a couple of options here, right? So we got A, we got B, we got C. It should immediately become obvious to you as you're looking here. We want to be on B. Why is that? That gives us access to indifference curve 2. This is called marginal analysis. So what do we do here? This is the consideration of costs and benefit of an additional unit of consumption. So if I'm at A, right? If I'm at A, I've spent all my money. I have a lot of apples. I have very few bananas, right? If I'm at C, I have very few apples, very many bananas. The mixture between those two things is what gets me to B. Now, the budget constraint forms an important part of how it is that we get here, right? Because I could be on this indifference curve with that same number of bananas if I could then have more apples at that point, right? But I can't reach this point because the budget constraint doesn't permit it. I can't afford that combination of apples and bananas, right? Okay, so this is the central model of choice. I hesitated when I wrote that down in the notes. This is the mathematical mainstream economics way to think about this. And that has a lot of baked in mathematical assumptions, which we're going to talk about as we go forward in this course. But I want us to be thinking in this mindset of marginal analysis, budget constraints. It's going to be a big factor all throughout this course. Okay, these combine to give us a really important tool, a really important insight called income effects and substitution effects. Okay, so an income effect is relatively straightforward. If you have the rise in the price of a good, it will cause an individual to choose less of all goods. Right? If something gets more expensive, effectively your budget has gone down. Right? So you were buying apples and bananas. Apples double overnight in price. I'm going to end up effectively being able to afford less. Right? So a rise in price is similar, not identical, and you'll see this here in a moment. Not identical to a decrease in income, but it reduces your effective income, your purchasing power, if you will. Okay. The other idea is a substitution effect. A substitution effect is a rise in the price. Is that a rise in the price of a good will cause an individual to choose less of that good? So we will substitute away from a good that is relatively expensive. Okay, let's take a look at how this plays out. Right. So I've got good A. I've got good B. We're going to start here at budget constraint 1. We're on indifference curve 1. Probably should have numbered the other way around, but I want to do it this way. There's a price increase in bananas. Price of good B goes up. What is that going to look like? Well, we were initially here to here. This is the budget constraint, right? And so all I'm saying is if we spent all of our money on B, we would end up with this, right? Because the price of A is irrelevant. If we spent all of our money on A, we would end up here. All the combinations of those things are just a linear combination of the relative prices. Okay, sort of straightforward. Now, we go from BC1 to BC2. Why is that? Well, this is because if I spend all my money on bananas and the price of bananas goes up, the amount that I can afford goes down. If I spend all my money on apples and the price of bananas goes up, then I can't. It doesn't change how many apples I can afford. Okay, so we got a price change. That's all from this. Now we can identify the substitution effect and the income effect separately. So this looks like a mess. Bear with me for a second. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the substitution effect. The substitution effect says what happens, what is the impact of the price effect separate from the income effect, right? So we hold we hold the income constraint equal, and we just look at the relative change in prices. Okay, so how have I done that? Well, here was the original budget constraint, and here's the new one. Relative prices make up the slope of the budget constraint, right? And so I take this budget constraint and this budget constraint. What's important about them? They are parallel. I now push this budget constraint. I'm calling this the pseudo budget constraint, PS pseudo budget constraint, because it's highlighting this idea that say I can still get to IC1. That's why this point B, right? We started A, but we're on B now. We can still get to this constraint. How would I change my consumption if prices changed such that I could reach the same indifference curve, but they represented the same relative prices, right? So that's how I have these two budget constraints parallel. The slope of the budget constraint is the relative prices. It's the price of A relative to the price of B, right? So notice, right, our old budget constraint and our new budget constraint, either one, but let's focus on this one. Our old budget constraint and our new budget constraint do not have the same slope because prices changed, right? That's what I'm saying here. Okay, so what's the substitution effect? Well, the substitution effect is how I would have QB1, but I have QB star instead, right? And I would get an increase in the number of apples. So the substitution effect shows us how much will I switch towards apples away from bananas if the price of bananas and apples changed and I had that relative price change, but it didn't decrease my income. Okay, once we have that, right, we're at QB star now. That's this guy here. We say, well, what's the income effect? What's the income effect? The income effect now is saying, given that I have the shift from A to B based on the substitution effect, so the price of B went up, so now I'll decrease the amount of B that I consume. I'll increase more of A. So I'll move from A to B. I'll move from QB1 to QB star, etc. How much do I decrease the amount that I consume of good B, of bananas, just because of the income effect, because now my total purchasing power has gone down? Well, we have this perfectly set up. We have an income effect, right? Because an income effect would just change the intercept of the line, not the slope of the line. So we can see we would go from point B to point C. Notice, right, this has a really elegant appearance here. It's going down at a 45, and that's going to lead us to go from QB star to QB2. Okay, so what's the total effect? It's to go from QB1 to QB2, right? So just as straightforward as can be. I deleted all the pseudo curves. In fact, let's just do that really quickly. If I just took that pseudo curve out and I said, what's the effect here? What's happening? We would go from here to here, and we would go from here to here, right? And we'd say the total effect is QB1 to QB star. How did we get there, though? It's the totality of the substitution effect and the income effect, okay? The big takeaway here is that there are two parts to a price change. Two parts to a price change. This is going to be important any type of analysis that we're doing when we're looking at what's the effect of price change is going to be. Okay, I want to turn now to the quintessential public finance topic, that is public goods. What is a public good? Well, really want to think about what's a pure public good. A pure public good is a good that is perfectly non-rival and non-excludable. So non-rival good, non-rival in consumption, because you can also have non-rival in production, but we'll focus on consumption for now, is an individual's consumption does not affect another's opportunity to consume the same good or service, right? So if you and I go to the store, here's an example, right? I went to purchase a car last week because my previous one had been in an accident, right? I go in there, I want to buy a minivan to haul my kids around. You also want to buy a minivan. You show up. One of us is going to get the van, right? And car production is way down right now because that market, probably a topic for another day, but that market is extremely tight right now, right? So if you and I begin to bid against each other and you win, then I won't end up with a car. That good is then rival. So what's non-rival, right? You and I are sitting in traffic. I turn on the radio. You turn on the radio. We go to the same channel. Does my radio being on have any effect on your radio being on? It does not. That's because our radio is non-rival in consumption. Okay. The other idea is what we call non-excludable. The textbook, in this case, definition is pretty bad. I think a much better definition comes from economist Tyler Cowen. Tyler Cowen says non-excludable is when the cost of keeping non-payers from consuming the good or service is prohibitive. So it's difficult for me once I've produced something to prevent you from getting it, right? So how is it that cars are excludable? Well, once it's produced, there's only one of them. They are rival. How do they keep you from having it after they've produced it, right? They send it to a dealership. The dealership has security. You'd be stealing, right? So there's a sort of natural institutional set of laws that make that difficult, right? So what type of examples do we see of this? Some places you might go to a store, you might see razor blades or something like that. Certain types of medicines, you can't just go and buy them. They put them behind the counter, right? This is because they're excludable. Even the Snickers bar, which you could easily grab and put in your pocket, is still excludable, really, right? Because you have to be committing a crime to do that. Now, there's lots of gray area there. Anything with public goods, there's going to be. Okay, so what's something that's non-excludable? Tyler Cowen's example, I think, is really insightful. It's fireworks, right? I put on a fireworks show. You've done this, right? July 4th, you went down, you bought some fireworks. Your neighbors were out across the street also enjoying their July 4th evening, and you were going to shoot off some fireworks, but you thought, well, I don't want them to free ride on me. I don't want them to be able to see my fireworks without paying. I should demand some payment from my neighbors. But you realized very quickly, actually, the cost of keeping them from seeing my fireworks show, very high. How are you going to do that? It's probably impossible. Once you shoot them off, anybody that's in range to see it and hear it's going to be able to take in your fireworks show. Okay, so let's make a little analysis tool here. This is just rival and excludable. If they're both, right, if it is rival and it is excludable, we call that a public good, right? Ice cream, Snickers bar, the bottle of water in your hands, that's a private good. Okay? If it is not rival and it's not excludable, that's a pure public good. The best example of this is national defense, right? Is it rival? No. If they're defending the country, they're defending you and you're my neighbor, they're also defending me. Pretty hard to exclude people, maybe like outlying regions. Maybe they could exclude all of Alaska or all of Hawaii because they're not contiguous 48 states, right? Other than that, pretty hard. Excludable, once we produce national defense, how do we keep people from partaking in the national defense? Pretty tough, right? Okay, so then we have some goods that are rival. Yes, rival, no excludable. We call those impure public goods, right? So some things are rival, but not excludable. Some things are excludable, but not rival. Those are both examples of impure public goods. So things that are rival, that are non-rival, but they are excludable. Well, we'll get some examples of that here in a second. Let me talk about the free rider problem. Okay, so the free rider problem is someone enjoys the benefits of a public good without paying. This, of course, leads to under provision, right? So we have something, we're producing it publicly, right? The government is providing it. We're not asking people to pay for it. How do we know then that they're getting enjoyment out of it, right? So if I put off the fireworks show, we'll probably have too few fireworks shows in this case, right? Because it's not reducing anyone else's enjoyment to see the fireworks show. It's hard to exclude people from it. And so when we need to pay for the thing, fewer people will be able to enjoy it without paying for it, so fewer people will pay for it than otherwise enjoy it. Okay, so let's take a look at this. What's the optimal provision of private goods? Private goods, of course, should happen through a market. The reason is efficiency. There's two types of efficiency: productive efficiency and allocative efficiency. For the reasons that we talked about before, we already know that goods and services are produced at the lowest cost through a market because of productive efficiency, right? So goods have opportunity cost, resources, right? That is items, commodities, it is inputs, it is land, it is effort, right? Labor, so both your education and your time. These can be used for other things. So if I want to produce something, I need payments to those things, right? If I want to build a table, I have to buy the lumber. If I want to buy the lumber, other people might want to build swing sets or houses or desks. I have to buy that. The price will determine what the highest alternative use of it. If I'm willing to pay that price, then I get it, and should be the case that my use is the highest valued use of those things, right? So that guarantees that we're producing these things at the lowest cost. But there's another type of allocative efficiency that another type of efficiency that we hinted at earlier. This is called allocative efficiency. This is when the mix of goods and services produced is what society wants, right? So what do markets give us? Markets give us not only what it is that we want, it gives us at the lowest cost that it can be produced at, right? Importantly, hugely important in the context of this class, government intervention cannot achieve either of these things. There's no situation in which it can achieve them. So when we talk about market failure as a reason for a government to come and intervene, it must be the case that the situation is so bad, right, that the market can't do either of these things, and the government solution would be less bad than that. Okay, so that's how we want to evaluate markets. Okay, so let's take a look at optimal provision of public goods. First, I want to make a couple of really important points. A lot of things that are publicly provided are not public goods, right? We have public television, we have public radio, we have public security, we call those police officers. We have public fire protection, firefighting, right? None of those things are public goods. None of those things are public goods, right? They are impure public goods, right? Obviously, we see that television and radio don't have to be publicly provided. So even though they are non-rival, because they are excludable, it is very straightforward for these to be provided privately. How do we see that? Advertising is a good example. access fees, new technologies come along, right? So Sirius XM, things like that. Turns out it's pretty easy actually to exclude them, and therefore we don't have any reason to think that there's under provision of them. Okay, security, fire protection. These are things we're accustomed to being provided publicly. That doesn't make them public goods. One, because they're rival, right? It's very obvious that they're rival. How do we know this? Your and my house catch on fire at the same time. They answer your call first. You are accessing a good and therefore restricting my ability to access it as well, right? And so therefore it's definitely, this is maybe more a idea of what we call congestible, right? Security, obviously, as well, right? National defense and security related, but different things in a certain way. How might I employ private security? Well, there's some obvious cases, right, where places like a mall maybe go and hire security. Storage facilities might hire security, etc. You can hire people in order to provide such a service. And then my favorite thing that's not a public good is roads. I don't know why, but every time I bring this up in a class, I inevitably have one student who just can't possibly believe that roads are not a public good. Roads are both rival and excludable, and we know this very, very obviously. Why is it that we know a road is rival? Well, if you've had the misfortune as I have in the last month, you have been in a car accident. So I had a 16-year-old teenager decide he wanted his car to be where my car was and drove into me. We would call that rivalry. There's a piece of the road that I wanted access to that I was then denied access to in a car accident, right? There are less dramatic versions of this as well, right? You sit in traffic. You have road congestion. These are all examples of rivalry. Okay, roads are also excludable. We don't often see this, of course, with the technology these days. They're even more excludable than ever before, right? Where you have toll roads, you pay fees to drive on the road, and then, of course, this is a little bit prohibitive to the efficiency of the road if we have to stop and throw change in a till, right? Some of you may be young enough to not even really have done that. But it used to be the case that you would drive along a road, and when you got off the toll road and you went to get onto a publicly provided road, you had to put money in a machine. They often had a little bin, and you literally throw the coins in, and it would let you through. These days, most of those are done by license plate, and the government will send you a bill, or the private entity will send you a bill. You can buy a tag, RFID style tag that allows you to be scanned and just charge your account, right? So roads, clearly not a public good. They are both excludable and they are rival. Now, other types of things are closer to public goods but can still be provided through other ways. An example of this is bundling, right? So a road has, I got roads on the brain. A mall, for example, has a lot of things that look an awful lot like public goods, right? Open spaces, park benches, security guards even, right? Lots of things that are happening at a mall that seems like it'd be hard to sell them individually, but it's pretty easy. Whenever I build the space, I charge the rent to the retailers pay me, and then, of course, as a consumer, you pay some of that downstream through the prices that you buy in goods at a mall, right? Retirement communities are probably even a better example of this, or really sort of any housing residential area that would provide these kind of things, right? So a pool, a park, public activities, all these sort of things that are hard to exclude, right? It's not impossible to exclude people from a park, but it's somewhat costly to do so. Or you're going to pay people to monitor it all the time, right? They are rival, but it's more of the congestibility style of rivalry and so on, right? So you can bundle things together, get people in a housing district or retirement community or a mall and collect your money other ways. Of course, some things have what we call non-pecuniary benefits, right? So fame or other types of incentives, right? A good example is the internet. Probably many of the things that you partake in the internet you don't directly pay for, right? There are things, blogs that you read perhaps. Why is the person writing the blog? One, it might be a love of the topic or the field. So they might just do it for that reason. Another might be fame, right? They'd like lots of readers. I have a podcast. You'll see some of that later on in the semester. Why do I do that, right? It's because I love economics. I love talking about it, and I probably enjoy having a certain number of subscribers, views, listens, etc. Right? How about some weird ones, right? How about a trip to the moon, interstellar travel, right? Why is Elon Musk doing these things? Is it because he's getting a lot out of it? Maybe, right? I mean, there's lots of technological advancements there. Maybe it's an upfront cost, a loss leader, right? It gets his name in the news, and then you go and buy more Teslas because of that, etc. Right? Lots of other incentives here. My guess is, if you were as wealthy as Elon Musk, one of the things you might be thinking about is, how do I get people 100 years from now to remember my name? Private travel to the moon is probably a great answer to that, right? Okay, how about social norms, reciprocity, right? So some things are public goods, right? A clean house, clean dishes, etc. These have some non-rivalry, non-excludability. You know this if you've ever been a roommate, right? Your roommate leaves the dishes in the sink. You always end up doing them. So there's some violation of the social norms there. If you're married, right, you might divvy up the tasks that one way. I might mow the lawn, might wash the dishes. However it is we choose to split up those particular homemaking tasks. So things that would be public goods might just be able to be handled through social norms and reciprocity. Social norms is pretty broad. We think of lots and lots of examples of that. The last answer here is cost theory, right? So transaction cost, property rights can solve things that seem like they are not solvable by markets. We've got an entire lecture next week on that, so I'll just leave that here for now. Okay, let's do cost-benefit analysis. So I'm taking this out of Chapter 8 of the textbook, right? Let's think of a public project, and we're going to compare costs to benefits of public projects. We want to build a highway. Okay, so we want to build a highway. What's it going to cost to make it? Some obvious things come to mind. Asphalt takes 1 million bags. Labor, it takes 1 million hours. Maintenance, $10 million a year to maintain it. And then we got some benefits, right? So driving time saved, 500,000 hours a year. So depending on how many cars are driving on it, these are sort of technical things, right? And then lives saved. And then, of course, we have to value those things. Okay, so let's take a look. First thing that economists often try is what's called cash flow accounting, right? So we just add up what's paid for a public project. That's one way to count up the cost. This, of course, ignores opportunity cost, right? And so we're just saying, here's the value of the things it is that we paid for, but we don't have any sense of what the value of the alternative uses are in that case, right? So what's opportunity cost in this case? The first and most obvious thing is going to be, what is it that we could alternatively use the tax funds for, or what kind of benefit would individuals get if we didn't take that money away from them in taxes, right? One of my favorite questions to ask my graduate students, right, is how do you value the things that the government is providing for you compared to about a 30% raise, right? So just real rough heuristic rule of thumb approach to that. Between your sales taxes, income taxes, property taxes, let's say that adds up to about 30%. That's probably close to right for middle class kind of individual. Would you rather have a 30% raise, or would you rather have what it is the government's providing? Usually get lots of interesting discussion about that. So think about that for yourself. Maybe I'll put a discussion board up. Maybe you can just email me some thoughts that you have about that. Now, a big wrinkle here is imperfect markets. So let's take a look. Let's take a look here at this labor element, right? Let's take a look at that labor element. So we have an imperfect market, so it's not that everyone's clearing, there's some unemployment, etc. It brings up an idea called reservation wage, right? So the reservation wage is the wage below which an individual will not provide a given amount of labor, right? So wage above which an individual will provide, wage below which an individual will not provide. So bear with me for a moment here. See if we can make this definition make sense. Will not provide. a given amount of labor. Okay, so you're unemployed, you're offered a job. They say, we want you to come and use dangerous chemicals to fight a mouse infestation in this building, and we'll pay you $1 an hour. And you say, wait a minute, um, I'm going to school. I'm at WT. I'm studying hard. I need the time. I would like the money, but don't really want to get chemical poisoning. I'm not going to take $1 an hour, right? So they say, okay, we'll give you $10 an hour. We'll give you $12 an hour, $15 an hour. At some point, you're going to be willing to do that. Your reservation wage generally reflects the value of your alternative costs, your alternative values, your opportunity costs, right? So you have some value from not having a job, right? More free time, more time to study, etc. So not just any number will do. You have to be offered a certain wage in order to provide those hours worked. Now, I phrase this a little differently than sometimes you'll see it elsewhere in economics, right? Economics will say the wage below which an individual will not take a job or will not work or something like that. But I think it's really important to recognize the reservation wage is not a single number that causes you to get off the couch or not, right? It's false binary there. You really will provide a given amount of labor, right? Could my profession, could WT get more hours out of me? Yeah, probably, if they offered me a higher wage, right? So there's some 40-hour work week type number that I'll do for a specific thing, and then if you want to get 60, you got to pay me more. This is how overtime develops, right? I mean, overtime is partially a legal function, but we'd still have overtime even if there weren't laws on the books for that, because people would rather work 40 than 60, would rather work 60 than 80, and so on. Okay, next it brings us to an idea called rents. This is a little unusual, right, because we're used to the idea of paying rent in economics, so let me call it economic rents. Economic rents are payments above the opportunity cost. Okay, so we got an imperfect market. We're trying to hire the labor, right? The reservation wage is $10. The opportunity cost is $12, but we offer $15 an hour. That $3 an hour is a rent. It is a payment above opportunity cost. So we pay something to our resource, to our labor, above what its next best alternative use is, right? So let's say I value sitting on the couch at $10 an hour, and I'm offered $10 an hour, and then I go and I work. I'm indifferent between those two things. The rent is zero in that case. If I'm paid $11 an hour, that's $1 an hour of rents. Okay, so we want to measure not just our cash flow accounting, not just our what is it that we paid first pass, most basic approach to this. We also want to measure our future cost. The answer to this is, of course, our present discounted value. So this is the idea that $1 next year is worth 1 plus an interest rate less than $1 now. This just represents opportunity cost, right? So if I spend $1, I'm not foregoing $1, I'm foregoing $1 plus whatever interest I could have earned, right? So that's the time value of money. Now, in this class, what's really important is that it's not a firm doing this, right? So anybody who's had a finance class has done this, and all of this is very, very true in the context of any business, any individual, any decision making at all, really, right? But in this class, we're interested in taxation, we're interested in government expenditure, government choices, the public sphere. So the social discount rate is what really matters, right? This asks us the question, what opportunity cost is faced by society for a tax dollar spent? This is a much, much harder question, right? Because if you go up to the register and you're going to buy your Chick-fil-A for lunch and you're going to spend $1 there, what's the opportunity cost of that dollar, right? Well, it might be some alternative consumption. It might be the Snickers bar across the way, right? But you're choosing that thing. So we want to think about the future cost. So if we choose not to spend it, what will we do? We might put it in the bank. We might put it in investment. And we might get some interest rates, right? If we put it in a bank, it's going to be close to zero, right? So the present discounted value today, if we look forward a year, it might be $1.01 or something like that, which is why you don't feel too bad often about spending money on lunch, right? You're not sitting there thinking, oh, if I buy this, then this is a massive investment that I can't make down the road, right? Now, with public dollars, though, the opportunity cost is actually likely to be much bigger than the value of the thing it is that we're spending. And that's because of that political economy process, right? So a good example here in Amarillo, a few years ago, we built a baseball stadium. To do that, we increased taxes. Good example of this is the hotel occupancy tax, right? So somebody comes to Amarillo, they would like to stay here. Maybe you have guests in town to visit. You want to put them up in a hotel. You want to pay for their hotel. And the amount that you're paying has gone up. Now, the amount that you're paying, right, your opportunity cost, that social cost, right, social cost, is offset against the benefit that we're potentially getting out of that, right? If you don't care at all for baseball, for minor league baseball, for the sod poodles, right, then it's obvious then that the social discount rate, the opportunity cost is higher than the value that we got out of it, right? Now, the Office of Management and Budget typically uses 7%, and they do that because that is the average pre-tax return. I'll point out that that's endogenous to the choices that the government makes, i.e., is that 7% the number that we would get in the absence of the government doing things, especially monetary policy, that would change that average rate? The answer uniformly is going to be yes. I suppose some economists out there could argue, yeah, that number would actually be lower. We would get less return on our investment if the government did less because it provides the infrastructure for a thriving economy, etc. Of course, seems doubtful to me that that will outweigh the crowd out that would happen. Cover that more later, so I'm not going to delve into it too much here. But needless to say, the government's choices, especially at the national level, really even at the state level as well, is going to affect what that number is. So, there's some sensibility in choosing that number, but it's got problems as well. Okay, so that comes out, here's the numbers provided from the textbook. I'm not super interested in delving into all those things, right? So there's our cash flow accounting idea. There's our imperfect market, right? So they're saying they can hire half the workers at $20 and half the workers at $10 an hour. That's $15 an hour. I'll note here that there's an obvious missing if we're going to measure lives saved from the roads. We should probably also measure lives lost here due to the construction. Now, notice that I'm not saying lives lost from the labor, right? Because that is definitely a very real cost, but that should be factored in here. How do we know that? Because the laborers that are accepting a wage, that wage that they accept in should reflect their recognition that construction is a dangerous job. I worked construction in between summers when I was in college. There were several. I was at an industrial construction site. There were several near misses there. Almost got a metal spike dropped on my head from 6 stories up. That definitely would have hurt me. I had a hard helmet on. Don't know if that would have saved my life. Maybe I would just be crippled instead of dead. But the amount that they're paying me in that job, it's not that I went into a construction job with my eyes closed. You can get hit by heavy machinery. You can have equipment dropped on you. I even one time had a close call with some pretty severe dehydration, right? Those are dangerous jobs, much more dangerous than being a college professor. So I would point out that the cost-benefit analysis should be analogous to these lives saved, not to this labor, because that labor should be reflected, that risk aversion should be reflected in there, which sort of transitions us pretty nicely into our next idea, which is measuring the benefits. We're doing cost-benefit. We have to measure the cost. We have to measure the benefit. So first thing is valuing time saved. We actually have a pretty good idea here. And that is because wages reflect our opportunity cost. I'm willing to work because of that reservation wage to an amount commensurate to my alternative uses, right? So nobody's holding a gun to my head. I take this job, I get that pay. So wages actually do capture opportunity cost. Notice that this opportunity cost is leisure. So therefore, wages capture the value of leisure. So that's a pretty good effort there. I think there's maybe some element deep down inside us that makes us think, right, but is there that much variation in the way that we value our time that it's such that it's captured by wages when wages run such a high spectrum of things? I think that's a fair critique. Second idea is through survey. This is called the contingent valuation method. You send out a survey, you ask people how much would you pay for a road if it reduced your commuting hours by this many hours, 10 hours a week or whatever. 10 hours a week would be a lot. 10 hours a month, something like that. This has a lot of problems, right? The first is that it's non-binding, right? You're not actually asked to pay anything. That's the nice thing, right? I have a golf club. I want to sell it to you. I say, hey, are you interested in this club? You say yes. I say, how interested? Are you $150 interested? And you say yes. We got a deal. I hand you the club. You hand me $150. Then we know that's really how you valued it. If I send out a survey that says, how much would you pay for this particular golf club, right? And then you can say, man, that's a pretty good golf club. And then you write down $200. Well, I don't follow up with you and say, excellent, send me a check for $200. I'll send you the club, right? If you've done anything like bidding on a major auction sites, eBay would be a good example of this. This is how it works, right? It says you agree to pay this number. If you click enter on this bid, we're going to charge you for it, assuming you win, right? So maybe you lose and somebody else pays $210 and then you don't end up paying. But it's binding. That's what we mean by binding. The long and the short of that is on contingent valuation method, people lie. It's not malicious lying, probably, right? But it's nonetheless a non-truth. They end up saying, yeah, I would value 10 hours off my commute at $250 a month, but they're never actually asked to pay that, and so they probably overvalue that amount. Now, in theory, that bias could go either direction, but most likely that's going to go over. Just think about what would happen if you were sent some kind of survey about that. What kind of number would you put in there? You'd probably overestimate the value. This would be akin to like people overestimating how much they'll use a gym or something like that, right? Except it's even worse because it's non-binding. Now, another big problem with surveys, contingent valuation method, is that the format matters, right? A combination of issues, what order you put them in, how you frame them, they all change the answer. So it's hard to know how do we get the right answer. If I put building a new highway, building a new stadium, maintaining the roads that we have here, building a school, etc., how it is that we combine those issues will change the answer. So if I put a highway project against a new bike trail, I'm going to get a different answer than if I put highway project against a new school and a nice new park. I'm going to get different answers for how much people value the highway. The order also matters. Lots of studies have shown this, right? If you put the issue that you're studying first in a list of those issues, right? If it says highway and then park and then school, you're going to get a different answer than if you say school and then park and then highway. And then, of course, how you frame it really matters, right? If you, that in part could be like the number of hours saved, right? It's hard. People's behavior is going to change. There's that indirect effect that we talked about earlier. So if people's behavior changes dramatically in response to the highway, perhaps we just cause more cars to drive through and we don't really actually save you that as many hours as we promise. That's one type of framing. Another type of framing could just be how it's written, how it's worded, what other projects are around it, etc. Contingent valuation surveys in general are going to be pretty low value in this kind of case. Okay, and then third will be what we call revealed preference. Big idea in economics. We'll talk about more of that here in just a moment. But the simple idea is that actions reveal value. So if we had a situation where people ended up paying for toll roads and we could measure how much it got used, for example, that would give us an idea. We might have to do some mathematics there. It wouldn't be one for one about how it is that is valued. Okay, now let's get on to the hard/weird part. How do you measure those values that would be saved? Let's say that number is right, which is probably easier to estimate than we would think because we have long histories of traffic, right? And so we can say when we rebuild a road, we have a sense that saves X many lives per miles driven, whatever, right? So I think it's tempting to say we wouldn't know that number at all, but we have a pretty good historical record. It's actually pretty possible, right? The first thing, anytime an economist starts talking about valuing lives, it says, "Is this ethical? Aren't lives priceless? Aren't lives priceless?" This, of course, runs into some serious problems. One is we're talking about um, the value of a statistical life, the value of a life on the margin, right? And so if you're going to go and do a project, right, and it says we can save 10 lives building a new highway, or we can save lives renovating the water sanitation. If you're saying that those lives are priceless, we can't do a comparison on those kind of grounds, right? When you're saying, wait, 5 lives, 10 lives, even if they're priceless, of course we could. That's not how math works, right? If you use infinity, it doesn't change those kind of things, right? Nonetheless, I will acquiesce, and I think this is probably what most of you listening to this lecture are going to feel in your hearts. There's something sort of unethical about that, and you might do that for many different grounds, many different reasons. I will point out, if you're coming at it from a non-religious perspective, you want to think hard about what it is that would give you grounds to make such an objection. So the humanists in the crowd, it's not obvious where that answer would come from. Different types of religions in this point are going to have different kind of objections. This is not a philosophy class, so I'm going to leave that there, except to say it should be something interesting for you to think about. What is it that makes this what is it that causes all of us to have that same kind of reaction? That this is kind of a questionable process, gives us something, gives us a bad feeling in our stomach when we start talking about this kind of topic. It happens for me too, even though I'm an economist, even though I've read lots of these papers and read this kind of literature before. Even when you run into this in grad school and you got a bunch of people studying for their PhDs in economics, doesn't make it any easier. So I'm not a philosopher. I have my own take on it. Happy to talk to you about that. If you want to come to office hours, call me on the phone, shoot me an email, whatever. Happy to talk about that, but I'm going to leave that out for now. Now, these methods, though, all really take a materialist approach to it, right? Which is to say, we're really looking at how people value their own lives. There are different ways that we could measure, we could use a method to value this, right? The first thing that the author in the textbook, I'm taking this whole cost-benefit section out of the textbook, which I'm going to take lots of material from this class from the textbook, but probably just as much material from other places. I'll give you sources and resources, just like I mentioned earlier with the excerpt of Stephen Landsberg book. The first thing that the author looks at is the political process, legal payouts, what happens when there's faulty car parts or when there's train accidents that kill people, and then we look at how much are we willing to pay to prevent those things or to repay those deaths, etc. Those numbers run the gambit everywhere. There's a table in the textbook, which I've not reproduced here, but that shows kind of all the different measurements of those kind of things. I think this is really bad effort. This is really poor and stupid, and the reason for this is it's a legal process. It has nothing to do with how we actually go about valuing lives. Right, we want to remember, really importantly, democracies, representative governments, really, right, those are probably the two best examples, but even in other inferior types of governance, don't replace a market, right? It's impossible for that to be the case. There's no price signal, there's no price mechanism. All those allocative and productive efficiencies that are so important to the way that modern life has excelled are absent in democracy. Democracy is trying to solve a different set of problems. Let's not pretend like it's trying to solve market problems, right? So keep those two things distinct in your mind. That's why I think the political process, legal payouts, valuing life, pretty ridiculous approach to it. Now, the next attempt, right, is probably the first thing that you thought, given what we had talked about earlier in this lecture, is wages, right? Okay, so we measure wages, we add it up, and then we get, okay, this is how a person is choosing to spend their time. We add up that amount of time spent times their wage, and etc. Now, in the way that time saved is captured pretty well by wages, in part because it's a short-term process. It is not captured with wages when it comes to, leisure is not captured by wages when it comes to measuring the value of a life saved, right? Because that marginal value of our time is different than the total value, of that leisure. And I'll point out that it's not capturing the other things that make life worth living. So whether I will give up another hour on Saturday to come into work in exchange for X amount of wages does a great job capturing the value of the time saved, because that's a measure of things on the margin. And you're saying, well, why can't we just add up all those things over time and get a good estimate of that? Because this is omitting other types of value that existing or not existing is different than being at work or not being at work. Examples of these things, right? Your people that you care about, people that you care about being with, institutions, right? Your church, your school, your hobbies, all those things, people that care about you and are going to miss you if you're gone. Yes, there's some element of that where if you're at work, you're missing out on those things, but that's a marginal estimation versus existential estimation, right? Also, things about your place, your culture, society, the more local, the more powerful these are, obviously, right? Hopefully you have a group of people to whom you belong and have meaning, give meaning, both get meaning to and from, right? And I'll just point out, right, all of this is extremely materialistic focus. It ignores those non-material components of how we would measure this. So again, probably better than the political process, but still extremely limited. Valuing a life saved is really hard. Okay, the next try is contingent valuation. This survey process is probably just as bad, I'd say worse than before, for all the same reasons, so I'm not going to delve into that. Now, I think what's really interesting is actually revealed preference, right? So in the textbook, they mention compensating differentials, and point out how much risk we take on going into a job that has more or less risk, how much more we have to be paid to do that. That, I think, is a sensible approach to it. Now, whether you can extrapolate that far enough to get the entire value of a life saved calculated is not clear to me, but it's a heck of a lot better try than anything else, right? So job A has 10% chance of being injured over whatever, let's say a decade, and job B has 15%. That'll at least give us some sense of how much more we have to pay people to do that kind of thing, right? So you have tasks that are similar, dangerous, menial jobs are more likely to be dangerous, right? So if I'm driving a trash truck versus if I'm what is the quintessential dangerous job, Alaskan crab fishing, right? The pay differential between those two things. Now, a lot of things would go into that, right? So a job has skill requirements. It has how easy is it to get somebody replaced, right? So why does doctor, lawyer, why are those very high paid jobs? Because they're very high skilled, high education. It's very difficult to replace, right? Why is truck driving a pretty good paying job? Well, it's less the skill, although certainly there is an element of skill there, and it's more because it's an undesirable, difficult, dangerous job, right? It's much more dangerous to be driving a truck professionally than it is to be lecturing students in a classroom. It's much more unpleasant to sit in a truck on the highway for hours and hours than it is to be a doctor or a lawyer engaged in professional practice that has a lot of social status value along with it, right? And so those compensating differentials probably give us a good glimpse into the risk element of jobs. I would point out something that the textbook didn't, which is insurance, right? And so how it is that people insure themselves against injury and death probably also gives us a hint here. I'm not going to go into the details too much. Okay, let's combine these things and wind up this very long lecture. Hopefully future lectures will be a little bit shorter, but Here's the calculation. I've noted some different types of problems. I really wanted to go through this just to kind of give us a thought process, cost benefit analysis. That if you're interested in the numbers, you can go to the textbook. If you don't have the textbook and you're interested in seeing this, I'm happy to send along excerpts of that. And so the author goes and calculates the first year cost and then the total cost at a time over time as discounted by that discount rate, and gets that number $258 million of total cost. They say, okay, $17 an hour is the average value for an hour saved in driving. Notice that an hour saved would have different value for different things that you're doing. Right, so driving is annoying because I can't be doing other things other than listening to music or podcasts. So for me, I don't really enjoy driving all that much, but I do enjoy listening to podcasts, so that offsets that cost a little bit. Other people really hate driving, and then I know some people that actually like driving and even like driving long distances, so saving time is less important to them in that sense, right? An hour saved... an hour saved in other places, maybe exercise, for example, might not be that valuable to some people because they might really enjoy that process, right? So if we had a pill that just imbued fitness on us, that might not be as valuable to some people because they actually like going to the gym, they actually like working out, they actually like fitness culture. Other people, right, it's a complete drag to have to go to the gym. That might not be very valuable. Okay, so notice that would be the average, and it would be the average specifically for driving. And then he comes up with that $7 million a year. $7 million per life. The $7 million per life number is the average value of a statistical life, basically taking sort of I can't remember if it's the average or the median. I want to say the median value of basically all the estimates. So it's sort of like a meta-analysis, if you will. More on that in the textbook. I don't think those methods are super good, so I didn't want to dwell on that, but I imagine some of you will find that very interesting. So therefore, he gets that first year benefit pretty low, but the total benefit over time pretty high. So how you discount it really, really matters in that case. They're saying, look, whatever the life of the highway, right, because you have to rebuild the highway 10 or 15 or 20 years, that would calculate out to $363 million in value. Now, notice that it doesn't capture the opportunity cost of this thing. Does this mean this should be a project that we do? If you're looking at this table, you're tempted to say yes. At the end of the day, I want you to remember this ignores that opportunity cost. What else could we spend it on? Could, instead of building a highway, we build a stadium? Could we build a park? Could we build a school? Could we just not collect that money in taxes? All of those things might have a cost-benefit analysis much higher than $363 million. This is just an example, and I just want to get you guys thinking about these kind of things like economists do.